what do you think about shadow work being an antidote for a regressive society? Do you think that that's right? I mean, what I mean by that is, if people did their shadow work, would we still have this regressive society? Is my question.
Oh, no, because remember, you're opening up communion with guides. See, when you're talking shadow, as you well know, it's an archetype, so it's a little bit deeper than what we just said. The inner dialogue, the basic 101. Oh, well, there's an unconscious, a preconscious, and an ego, or an id, and a superego, and an ego ideal. That's all just 101 stuff. What you're talking about now is holy work. It's a far deeper. Now, as a matter of fact, it doesn't, you asked about will when we talked before. It's not really an active will, or will is part of it, right? But this is already going on. Shadow work is already going on. It's, in fact, that's why we call it unconscious. It happens when we're not even aware of it.
Yeah.
So the real way to look at it, along, say, lines that Freud and Jung would okay, you know, if they were critiquing you, they'd say that what all you're doing is become consciously aware of what is going on unconsciously. And this does have roots even back into the philosophers who talk like this as well, right? But again, shifting gears a little bit, don't forget, it is also, when I say it's already ongoing, I mean that is because the whole of modern ego existence, ego consciousness, is itself in a healing sphere, a healing phase from the old ancestral trauma. We don't want to talk about that too much, but I always like to add it in. The first chapters of Dragon Mother had to factor this in, because everything we experience in history is a slow, gradual healing from an old ancestral trauma that, you know, the ego has dissociated from. That's why we have ego defenses. All the psychologists in the world know about ego defenses, but very few of them know what we're talking about. You wouldn't believe why the ego has defenses. It's got defenses for things we can't even fathom, that are not even factored in by most psychology today, not factored in by sociology. And that is that the brain, the mind, the consciousness was severely traumatized by terrestrial, you know, cataclysm and all the rest of it. And Julian Jaynes touched on this, Immanuel Velikovsky, but really it was never delved into that deeply. Mm-hmm. Probably Velikovsky is the best, right? And then bringing it into psychology, you know, it's about a massive seismic trauma that took place. So everything that's happened since that trauma, since 3,000 years BC, or, you know, the date is a big argument, right? Let's forget about that. But everything since the birth of Christ, all what we know of consciousness, why religion has arose as a stabilizer, why science, why metaphysics, you know, why even modes of sociology have all arisen, why denial has arisen, why self-deception, why schizophrenia. I mean, this original seedbed of trauma is the soil for all pathology, right? Although later on the pathology takes on bizarre, you know, twists and turns, right? But again, to answer your question, shadow work then becomes the individual's way to deal not only with something ontogenetic, a personal hang-up from his childhood, you know, we'll get to that in a minute, how important those ontogenetic personal traumas are, but this wider seedbed of ancestral trauma, because all later trauma above it, right, later, in other words, in history, if they're constantly traumatized, it's like these little keys, little antenna, little tuning forks. If trauma is constantly, you know, hitting on them, finally by the law of resonance, which is a cosmic law just like gravity or light, is awakening the deeper dragon of trauma below. Now, in fact, our architects of control all know all about this, by the way, the Bernays types and Aldous Huxley types, they know all about this and co-opt this. But even besides that aspect, we don't get free. So shadow work to me is, as Jung said, a deepening look at the, you know, working to see who your archetypes were, which ones are friendly, which ones aren't. And we'll get into all of that in a minute. But it's also with in mind. In other words, I think it's better. I think if you do your shadow work with this in mind, it's actually better. It improves the situation. When you realize that the shadow is not just a personal shadow, it is an ancestral one. All human beings suffered trauma, both you know, in the terrestrial sense and then in the psychological sense. So there's a resonance has been set up. And so this is the character of the shadow. Once you start getting in touch with the shadow, it might have a character that is so utterly bizarre that unless you know what we're talking about now, you'll have a very, very paltry, you know, relationship with it or explanation of it. So there's many dimensions. I try to bring that to bear, you know, these little bit subtleties. But yes, unless you have identified the shadow, you know, it's going to be impossible to heal, either from traumas of your own personal life, which could be very considerable. And all the shadow is rage, really, right? And I think that what needs to be brought out is that it's not that the shadow is an entity. Shadow is a realm. Shadow is a shadow realm into which you've dumped or been forced to dump all of these characteristics that are of the true self. They're all legitimate. This is the most crucial thing to understand. They're not illegitimate, they're legitimate. But a mad, abnormal society, right, and parents addicted to adultism recast your character, your will, and your identity as being negative, as being something, you know, delinquent. And no doubt there is that mixture of delinquent things that we all need to progress. But my idea is that we'll normally progress. You know, by teenage years, there shouldn't be any delinquency. And if there is, that's because something went wrong even in the previous Oedipus complex, because those 7 years are a microcosm of 700 years. And then the period in the womb is like 700 years as well. So one has to see it that way. But again, without getting into all those digressions, the idea is that you've got to process these darker emotions, right? One of which is anger and rage, anger, whatever, right? But there's also guilt and shame and all of these other things involved in there. And they're all legitimate, but they're all censored by those ego defenses again. And they're all housed in the right brain. And then finally in the body, we'll have hopefully get into that thing today about the Reichian approach to all of this shadow work. Because I'm a real disciple, not so much of Jung's description of shadow work, I certainly am, and Erich Neumann, but my God, right? There's a whole other thing that I bring to bear, which is the Reichian definition. I know he never used the word shadow work explicitly. Everything he's talking about pertains to Jungian shadow work in the sense of how do I then access these darker emotions, which my society forbids me, which my parents forbid me. How do I get in touch with those? And this is where dream work and everything comes in, we were talking about before. But just to always fill that background in of the age of catastrophe, I think is essential as well.
Brilliant. Can you tell us about individuation, what it means to become individuated?
Yeah, because that's the opposite of habituation. When we're talking about collective factors and growing up in a culture that's already dictating to you through your parents, what they want to see, what they're going to pin the badge on, to you for is doing as she did, doing as he did. Don't you know your cousin's way smarter than you? She's getting better grades in the school, or that fella kicks a ball better. I mean, why can't you? Look at the way you're dressed. Look at the way your hair is. I mean, look at the interests that you have. We're not interested in any of that. What? Right? So the entrapment is habituations. You'll get the medal for habituating, meaning casting all your individual traits aside, unless you're with enlightened parents who don't ever do this. But there are very few and far between. And then on the little bit higher level, individuation is the work that is holy work. It is the Siddhartha road. It's very difficult work. And for a start, one thing that people miss with this is that individuation, right, is a process. Shadow work is a process. Identifying the shadow it doesn't happen in 24 hours. It's a process that may continue through the whole of life. So this is a missing piece because we're in an instant shrink wrap, drive-through culture, which they think that even some of these psychological things we're talking about are something that you do or you get done. No, it never ends. It's a process. And unless you have that long haul, you have your setting is for the long haul. And that, of course, is very difficult because nobody around you is into that. Nobody's going to accompany you. Everything is immediately dispenser-like. So there's no formula involved here at all. Because once you set about that process, oh my God, these archetypes are going to lead you round and round, up and down, inside out. They're not going by any bloody formula. So this involves the entire process. That's the key word of self-discovery, right? And that even entails a underworld journey or journeys, plural. I went into this in the Path of the Fool. We went into that in detail. And then even finally, to extrapolate what that underworld journey is in layman's terms, it's just a process of sensitization. So individuation is akin to sensitization, a turning within to know what do I feel and think about all of this. See, the weird thing that our Western society has taught us, the Western tradition, one of the failings of the Western tradition is that, and this was deconstructed by people like Heidegger and Nietzsche and others, but we think that consciousness is a matter of thinking. And that's utterly false. It's not. It has nothing to do with thinking. Thinking is an emanation, a later, derivative emanation, because consciousness is really about feeling, a special kind of inward introspective feeling. And then as that intensified for the human race, intellectuality by the way of the left brain and language articulation became a further extrapolation, right? It's like an emanation of the core real.
So you say feeling, but is it also the same as knowing, like an inner knowing?
Yeah, knowledge of the heart is how Schwaller de Lubitsch. You know something, even Freud, I'll have to look up this quote while we're talking, that Freud even said this, that it's not a matter just of intellectual processes, it's an actual act of feeling. So consciousness, I think if this was taught to children, I think if we understood this, it would change everything. Consciousness as we know it, right, is all about feeling. And only on a secondary derivative level does now come process of thinking, process of articulation, because it's a way of saying, this is such an intense experience. Another process of trying to verbalize it, first through poetry, then through music, and then through utterance, to share it with the other, to see if the same process is something they've experienced and vice versa, right? But it's all later. It's all later. That's why the Hermetic symbol was this. Go back to Hippocrates, go back to the Hermetic tradition. Go back to the phi ratio. The symbol is a circle with a straight line. That's about quiet. It's about he who speaks does not know. He who knows, does not speak. So tremendous Hermetic principles.